And it was also a time when many people of African descent were coming to Canada via the Underground Railroad and through other ways, not only to escape enslavement, but to live freely, create communities, and just live in peace with their families. However, upon arriving in Canada, people of African descent quickly came to realize that they were not welcome and that Canada, like the United States, was steeped in racism, colonialism, white supremacy, and other legacies of enslavement. I believe there are widespread myths and misconceptions, views, and ideas that some Canadians have that we are somehow better than the United States, that the United States had enslavement and we here in Canada did not, that we here in Canada are immune to racism, and that we welcomed and still welcome people of African descent with open arms. However, these inaccurate views and ideas are traced back to not knowing our Canadian history, and that these histories were not and are still not in many cases being taught in classrooms across the country. Many people still do not know that Canada had enslavement for over 200 years, from the early 1600s all the way to when it was abolished in 1834 across the British Empire. Now, it first was under the French. Canada was then known as New France, and then it was under the British, and Canada was known as British North America.
That's actually a lie. Slavery did not start in Canada under the French. It started centuries before that. The Indian tribes that covered this country had slavery as an integral part of warfare and economics. Not just the Mohawks in the Ontario and Quebec areas, but in the West, the Haida. Slavery, of course, existed on every continent in the world other than Antarctica. Slavery has touched every society, but it was the British North American land that when the British Empire declared slavery to be illegal, Canada abolished it as well. And when that happened, there were more Aboriginal slaves and slaveholders than there were of any other sort. In fact, I recall looking up a census at the time. Around 200 years ago, the Black population of Toronto was 16. Not 1,600 or 16,000, 16 people. So to portray Canada as a racist place, as a place of slavery, and to imply that it only started when the Europeans came here is a lie. Now, I had never heard of that person before. Shannon Oyeniran is her name, and I've Googled her, and she has a degree in slavery studies from a British university. I can only imagine what that's like. But before that, she was for 7 years an administrator and other staffer at an old folks home. So she's certainly well schooled in book learning. She's a damn liar, but the world is full of liars. She might say I'm a liar, but her lies were paid for by the government of Canada. This was their reintroduction of our founding father, our founding prime minister, to hurl accusations at him, but much more importantly, at Canada, to imply we weren't the safe haven for Black people. Joining us now to talk about this outrage and what he might do about it is our friend, Dr. Mark Milke, the boss of a rather new civil liberties-oriented charity in Canada called the Aristotle Foundation. And he joins us now via Skype from Calgary. Great to see you again, Mark.
Thanks for having me on, Ezra. It's great to be here.
Can you imagine that? I mean, they reintroduce Sir John A. Macdonald and his home. I guess we should give them some marks for not boarding it up like the statue at Queen's Park. But they reintroduce him to denounce him. I haven't heard the Liberal government denounce, let's say, the terrorist government of Iran in the vitriolic language that they saved for our founding prime minister. Just so gross.
Well, it's maddening, and the clip you just showed of the lady there that talked to this revisionist kind of approach to John A. Macdonald's home, and her claim that Blacks weren't welcome in Canada. Look, I think it's a mistake to romanticize history either way. To see Canada was somehow this pluralistic, liberal in the best classical liberal sense place in the mid 19th century, that there was no racism. I mean, that would be a denial of the facts as well. But to say that Blacks were not welcome when she which yourself mentions the Underground Railroad. Let me give you another example that I pointed out in one of my books a couple of years ago, The Victim Cult. And we also touch on this a little bit in the first book for the Aristotle Foundation, the 1867 Project, Why Canada Should Be Cherished, Not Canceled. There's a story of how a cohort of Black Americans came from California to Victoria in 1858. And they wrote home to their relatives and friends in California to do what a lot of people in Victoria do, not only to brag about the flowers, presumably, but to say this is a really tolerant place compared to California, which was pretty racist, anti-Black, of course, and anti-Asian at the time in 1858. And this cohort of Black Americans that had arrived in Victoria found that they were welcomed by the governor, by the Anglican Archbishop, that they could become citizens and vote after 2 years and run in the school board elections, in the local municipal elections, so on and so forth. Now, these Black Americans did encounter prejudice over the next few years, in part from some Indigenous tribes, the Cowichan up island from Victoria, and also white Americans who increasingly also moved to British Columbia, the colony at that point, from the United States. So it's not like Canada was a place free of racism. But ironically, Black Americans, and at one point there were several hundred Black Americans in Victoria, Maryland, that had moved up there to escape the racism of the United States. So that speaker that opened or christened, I guess, this new turret, the Johnny Macdonald House there in Kingston, lacks facts, lacks nuance, lacks a bit of understanding of the age people lived in and the progress that had already been made by 1858.
Canada, of course, only came into existence in 1867 as its own legal entity. Before that, of course, it was part of the British Empire, the same British Empire that for 50 years dispatched the West Africa Squadron as part of the Royal Navy, that sole mission was intercepting Black slave ships, capturing the ships, arresting the slave traders, and returning the slaves back to Africa. They captured well over 1,000 such ships. It was an enormous effort, and we've talked before on the show about the British Empire borrowing in today's money $250 billion to pay for the emancipation of slaves throughout the British Empire. China didn't do that. Africa didn't do that. India didn't do that. It's astonishing that she would learn in her slavery studies degree that she wouldn't learn that Canada, look, like you, Mark, I won't deny
it's so one-sided.
Yeah. Was there racial tension? Sure, there was for everyone. If you were Irish, if you were Italian, if you were Jewish, but to say that Canada is inherently, it's so gross to me. Hey, I want to play the video that you guys made at the Aristotle Foundation. I want to stop talking for a moment about this disgrace over the weekend that Joe Warmington filmed. I'm so glad he was there with his camera. Let's talk about what you guys are doing about it. I think you guys have put together a video. Let's take a look at it now.
Why are some people trying to cancel Canada's history? You've seen the attacks on Johnny Macdonald, Henry Dundas, Matthew Begbie, and so many others. Even Mahatma Gandhi. These attacks are common, and they need to stop. Here are 3 reasons why. It's unfair to expect people in history to be perfect when some Canadians can't achieve that standard today. We demand historical figures hold 21st century views, but based on that standard, future generations will condemn us all. We focus on all of the bad and none of the good. For example, British colonialism ended slavery, including for First Nations. So, instead of canceling history, let's expand our perspectives, especially for those who helped build Canada. Henry Dundas, instrumental in ending slavery by appointing an anti-slavery governor. Johnny Macdonald, who fought for more funding for Indigenous Canadians to fight famine and smallpox and was key to Confederation. Justice Matthew Begbie, an early proponent of Native rights and who opposed anti-Chinese racism in British Columbia. Let's add more facts to our history. Reject cancel culture, treasure our past, and move Canada forward. If you agree, share this video and sign our petition to stop canceling Canada's history. For more, go to AristotleFoundation.org.
Well, there you have it, the AristotleFoundation.org. AristotleFoundation.org is where you can learn more about that, and that's the organization that Mark leads. I like your arguments there, but, and I think I've seen this video once before, and I think it's good. Those are great arguments for why we don't tear down statues and why we don't delete the past. But watching it, I fear that you miss the real purpose of tearing down statues. I think the purpose of tearing down statues is the tearing down. It's not even the statues. You mentioned Mahatma Gandhi. I mean, who could possibly disagree with him? He's almost a saint-like figure. But I think the purpose of the tearing down, the purpose, whether it's the Hamas protests or Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street or so many of these projects, it's the tearing down. It's the revolution. As our friend Dr. James Lindsay says, the issue isn't the issue, the revolution is the issue. So I think your counter-argument to cancel culture makes sense to me, because I'm trying to understand, how do you deal with historical figures that aren't perfect by today's prism? But I don't think you'll ever convince a terror downer to stop tearing down.
Oh, I don't think we will either. And I part of the goal of the Aristotle Foundation is to start telling the truth, right? Because it's not being told in Canada. So, and point out, and you're absolutely right. Look, a lot of these protests is too mild, but the tearing down crowd, they're nihilist, they're revolutionary, and they're utopian. But one of the arguments we make in the 1867 project, why Canada should be cherished, not canceled, by various authors, and I make it in the introduction to the book, is that you're looking at utopians, utopian revolutionaries, right? These are people, at least the Marxists in the 20th century, in the 19th century, they were looking forward. They were dead wrong about economics and how to, create a prosperous, flourishing, free society. The Marxists were dead wrong about that, but at least you could argue the Marxists were looking forward to create a utopia, paradise on earth. Weirdly, you've got people these days, when it comes to history, that expect people in history to be perfect, as if 40 million Canadians agree on everything today. 40 million Canadians are perfect today. Like, come on. So you're absolutely right. It's a revolutionary impulse. It's dangerous. But our goal at the Aristotle Foundation is to start telling the truth, which we've done with this video, which we do with the 1867 project, and move people forward and give people facts and informed history. Because I think, Ezra, actually, the majority of Canadians would agree with you and I that attacking statues of John A. Macdonald, refusing to offer nuance, as Parks Canada has done here, skipping other facts in history, is also a mistake. Let me give you one clear example. You referenced Indigenous slavery. So again, that speaker that talked at that John A. Macdonald kind of revisionist ceremony there at Macdonald's house there in Kingston, you're unlikely to see Parks Canada offer a tour in the near future of how Indigenous communities in British Columbia held slaves until the late 19th century over the objections of the British, which didn't have the capacity on the ground. I mean, British Columbia was a backwater at that point. There was no way to enforce anti-slavery legislation of the British Empire in what would become British Columbia when it joined Confederation, and before, when it was a colony. So those are facts that are worth knowing. Why? Not because we want to pick on Indigenous Canadians, but to point out, look, everyone's history, if you go deep enough, back far enough, has some flaws in it, to say the least. And it makes no sense to demonize John A. Macdonald and then to romanticize Indigenous peoples as if they come from some sort of perfect utopian, non-slave holding history. I mean, that's simply nonsensical. From the Haida to the Aztecs, to the wars in Ontario among Indigenous peoples before and after settlers got there, European settlers. I don't like that term, but I mean, using their language. So, what we're trying to do with the Aristotle Foundation is, of course, provide some facts and informed history. And that 2-minute video, thank you for showing, was our start to say, come on, people, let's get a little more sensible.